Hello, my name is Imani Floyd.
And here.
And
my name is Zoe Jordan. And this is TykesTube.
What is voting? What could it be?
Voting is how you show your support for a person or idea. You do this with something called a vote.
One of the ways we do that is by helping other young people understand everything there is to know about voting, even kids.
A vote is simply a choice, idea, or a person for something or someone.
Like, should we have pizza for dinner?
But for me, I'll choose no, but maybe you choose yes.
Who gets the vote? Well, that's a little bit more complicated. But I have a few of my friends here to talk about influential people that help us along the way.
You might think to yourself, I am just a student. But students were a major part of why we have the rights to vote. In February of 1960, 4 college students in North Carolina stayed in their seats at a lunch counter. This was after the staff refused to serve them because of the color of their skin. About 300 students soon joined their protests, which ended up being all over the news. This has sparked a bunch of sit-ins by thousands of students all over the South. The sit-in movement became the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, the major source of the student support in the civil rights movement.
Vote, 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 vote. We demand our right to vote. We demand our right to vote. We will not be silenced. We will not be silenced. Vote, 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 vote. We demand our right to vote. We will not be silenced.
Fannie Lou Hamer was an African-American voting and women's rights activist, community organizer, and leader in the civil rights movement. On August 31st, 1962, Hamer and 17 others tried to vote but failed a reading test, which meant she was denied this right. Hamer said, "You'll see me every 30 days till I pass."
Dear Tim and Moby, who was Fannie Lou Hamer? From Megan. Well, on August 22nd, 1964, a lot of Americans were asking that same question. That night, they turned on the TV to see Hamer on every news program. She looked like a nice, middle-aged lady, somebody's mom, or your neighbor. But in her home state of Mississippi, she was well known as a fierce voting rights advocate. For the past 2 years, she'd been fighting to get African Americans access to the polls. The Constitution said that the right to vote couldn't be denied due to race. But southern states had found all sorts of ways to get around the law. Stripped of their right to vote, black Southerners had no voice in a racist system. try to fight it, and you face jail time, intimidation, and violence. Hamer had experienced it all, and that night she shared her story. It was just a few minutes long, but full of hardship and brutality. Viewers who'd never heard of her before wept. Overnight, she went from being a local activist to a national civil rights leader. Hamer was born in Mississippi in 1917, the youngest of 20 children. Her grandmother had been enslaved, and her parents, like many descendants of enslaved people, were sharecroppers. A plantation owner rented them farmland in exchange for a share of their crops. But he also charged high rates for tools and other expenses. So, like most sharecroppers, they were constantly in debt. Fannie Lou had to leave school after 6th grade to help her family in the fields. As an adult, she earned a position of responsibility on a plantation. She recorded each farmer's harvest and tried to get them their fair share. Then, in August 1962, members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, visited her church. All around the country, the civil rights movement was heating up, and SNCC was one of the major players. Its student activists trained local community leaders to join the fight. In Mississippi, they focused on registering black voters. They told the congregation they could sweep out racist officials. Hamer was stunned. She didn't even know she had the right to vote. When SNCC asked for volunteers to register to vote, she raised her hand high. No, it wasn't that simple. An angry crowd gathered at the courthouse to meet the 18 volunteers. They tried to scare Hamer and the others from even trying to register. But the volunteers stuck together and made their way in. Inside the courthouse, the clerk was no more welcoming. He demanded the group pass a test before registering. They were asked to explain a legal clause about ex facto laws. Yeah, that was the whole point of literacy tests. To be nearly impossible to pass, so clerks could refuse anyone the right to vote. They could also demand a poll tax, a fee meant to discourage would-be voters. No surprise, all the SNCC volunteers failed the literacy test. On the way home, their bus was stopped by the police. They said its yellow color was illegal. Hamer sang to keep the group's spirits up until they were let go. That night, she was fired from her job and evicted from her home. The plantation owner had heard about her attempt to register. A few nights later, someone shot at the house where she was staying. Afraid for her children, Hamer considered leaving town for good. But she couldn't convince herself to leave the place her parents helped build. She rented a house from a neighbor and took a job with SNCC. Hamer's home became a gathering place for volunteers and civil rights leaders. Among them, she stood out. She wasn't male, young, well-educated, or middle class. She knew what poor black families endured because she'd lived it. That first-hand experience made her a powerful speaker. She would often break into song to motivate crowds. Before long, she was as well known for her singing voice as her activism. But her growing influence made her a target for racist attacks. She got threatening letters and phone calls, and her husband lost job after job. Someone even threw a bomb at her house, though luckily it failed to explode. Then, in June 1963, Hamer and 6 fellow activists were arrested. They tried to eat at a whites-only diner. Local police held them for 3 days, beating and torturing them. Hamer's kidneys were permanently damaged, and she lost sight in one eye. Hamer and other activists realized that local authorities weren't going to change unless they were forced to. So, in 1964, they started a massive voter registration drive called Freedom Summer. It brought hundreds of mostly white college students down to Mississippi. They went door to door, registering black voters. It was dangerous work. 3 volunteers were murdered in the first week. The nation could no longer ignore what was happening in Mississippi. For the rest of the summer, stories of beatings and shootings made headlines around the country. Then, at the end of August, Hamer and other activists went to Atlantic City, New Jersey. That was the site of the Democratic National Convention, the big event where the party chooses its nominee for president. Each state sends a group of people to cast the official vote. And no surprise, Mississippi's representatives were all white. Hamer's group was there to challenge their authority. Since the state excluded black voters, they said, the delegation was illegal. They were Mississippi's true representatives, and they had the voter registrations to prove it. Their protest caused an uproar, and Hamer was given a slot to speak. Before a national audience, she described what she had endured simply for trying to vote, being threatened and shot at by fellow citizens, being beaten by the police. She challenged the nation to consider its own values.
Is this America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our telephones off of the hook because our lives be threatened daily, because we want to live as decent human beings in America?
Her testimony replayed on the news for days. Hamer and her group weren't seated at the convention. But a year later, President Lyndon Johnson would sign the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It outlawed all kinds of barriers to voting, like literacy tests and poll taxes. And at the convention in 1968, Hamer was chosen to be an official delegate. She received a standing ovation. Hamer's activism continued way past her primetime moment. She fought for women's rights, protested the Vietnam War, and ran for office several times. She founded Freedom Farm, a cooperative to help black farmers climb out of poverty. When she died in 1977, she was buried there. Yeah, I guess it is your turn to roll.
John Lewis was a member of Congress. He fought for all people to vote. He came from Georgia.
On August 6, 1965, I signed into the Voting Rights Act. I am Lyndon B. Johnson. It took 100 years after the Constitution before black men could vote, but they continued to try to block black people from voting. Everything changed in 1965 with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It was meant to ensure that all Americans received the right to vote, granted in the Constitution.
I am Ella Baker. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. Hello, I am Bella. Today I'm going to be telling you about Shirley Chisholm. Shirley Chisholm was the first African American woman in Congress. She was also the first woman and African American to seek the nomination for President of the United States. Educationally, Miss Chisholm was a teacher and author. That will be all for today. Bye.
Shirley Chisholm was born on November 30th, 1924, in Brooklyn, New York, to parents from Barbados. She attended Brooklyn College for undergrad and earned a master's degree in elementary education from Columbia University. Ambitious women seemed unnatural at the time, but she used her moral character and relentless drive to push open doors for females in the political arena. In the early 1960s, Chisholm joined a local Democratic club. Chisholm's passion for politics grew as she decided to run for Congress for her hometown congressional district of Bedford-Stuyvesant in Brooklyn. In 1968, Chisholm was elected to Congress, becoming the first African-American congresswoman in the United States. As a congresswoman, she wasn't afraid to challenge the majority and stand up for what she thought was right. Her slogan was, "Unbought and unbossed." In 1972, Chisholm announced that she would be running for the 1972 Democratic nomination for President of the United States, becoming the first major party African-American candidate to do so. Her bid for the presidency, referred to as the Chisholm Trail, gained a lot of support from women, minority groups, and students. She was the candidate of the people. She was attacked 3 times during her campaign for the presidency, including an instance where a man tried to stab her. Despite strong opposition against Chisholm, she garnered votes from people in 14 different states and received 151 of the delegates' votes at the 1972 Democratic Convention. She was also aware of her status as a woman in politics. I've always met more discrimination being a woman than being black. She left Congress in 1983, but her influence in politics did not end there. By continuing to fight for education opportunities and social justice, Chisholm motivated young people to participate in politics. I'd like them to say that Shirley Chisholm had guts, she said. That's how I'd like to be remembered. Shirley Chisholm died of a stroke January 1st, 2005. She was posthumously awarded the Presidential Medal.
Hi, my name is Blake Wood. I'm here to talk about South Carolina Freedom Organization, also known as the Black Panther Party. It was started in 1965 by young civil rights activist Stokely Carmichael of the SNCC. In 1965, Clarence County in Alabama was 80% black, but no black people were allowed to vote. Carmichael organized a voter project in an effort to register blacks to vote. The members adopted the Black Panthers as a symbol. One man, one vote. Thank you.
Dr. King mobilized people to support
The
voting Rights Act.
Yep, that's where he gave his biggest speech. Dear Tim and Moby, can you do a Martin Luther King movie? Thanks, Amari. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was one of the most important leaders of the American Civil Rights Movement. That was the effort to extend equal rights to all people, regardless of race. Well, in the first half of the 20th century, that was a controversial idea. In many parts of the country, African Americans were barred from participating in ordinary life. They couldn't eat at the same lunch tables, go to the same schools, or even use the same bathrooms as white people. This practice of separating African Americans from white people was called segregation. In the South, segregation was enforced through Jim Crow laws. They made it illegal for African Americans to mix with whites. They policed black behavior, too. African Americans had to live in separate neighborhoods, hold specific jobs, and talk to whites with the utmost respect. Try to fight it, and you risk jail time, injury, even death. There were no Jim Crow laws up north, but unspoken rules still kept African Americans apart. In many places, white homeowners would only sell their houses to other white people. These informal codes ensured that African Americans remained second-class citizens. Martin Luther King grew up in the midst of all that inequality. He was born in 1929 to a middle-class family in Atlanta, Georgia. Both his grandfather and his father were pastors at a local church. King attended religious colleges up north, in Philadelphia and Boston. He noticed black and white people mixing more freely than he'd seen growing up. Though these cities had their share of racial tension, they were a far cry from the way things were down south. Dr. King moved to Montgomery, Alabama with his wife, Coretta, in 1953. He became a pastor and community leader. Around that time, a local woman named Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give her bus seat to a white man. King joined forces with activist Joanne Robinson to organize a massive boycott of the Montgomery bus system. Most black citizens of Montgomery refused to ride the buses for over a year. Many were violently attacked just for walking instead of taking a bus. Dr. King's house was bombed, and along with dozens of other protesters, he was thrown in jail. But these injustices drew national attention to the issue. And in 1956, a Supreme Court decision banned segregated buses. After that victory, King helped organize a group of churches dedicated to nonviolent protests for civil rights. He was inspired by the life of Mahatma Gandhi, whose nonviolent leadership helped free India from British rule. Over the next decade, King led protests and marches all over the country. The biggest was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963. Hundreds of thousands of people gathered in the nation's capital to support civil rights. It was there that Dr. King delivered his momentous I Have a Dream speech.
One day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today.
Yeah, kind of gives you goosebumps, doesn't it? King's gift for public speaking helped inspire millions of people. His words gave them the hope and courage to believe in the future he envisioned. 2 years later, the protests he led throughout Alabama caught the world's attention. People watched in shock as local police turned fire hoses and attack dogs on peaceful protesters. Well, people often feel threatened by change. In fact, making folks uncomfortable was kind of the point of all this protest. In a letter written from an Alabama jail, King said, "Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and establish such creative tension that a community that has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue." In other words, things change only when conditions are made so stressful, people demand it. Oh yeah, King was arrested lots of times during these marches, but the result was worth it. His work pressured Congress to pass groundbreaking laws, moving society closer to his vision. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 overturned segregation laws around the country. In 1964, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. He went on to fight against poverty and the Vietnam War. Then, in 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. His killer, James Earl Ray, was captured months later. King was only 39 years old, but in his short life, he'd changed the face of this country. Without his influence, who knows how long it would have been before equal rights were protected for everyone? Yeah, you're right. We still struggle with racial equality to this day. But thanks to Dr. King and other civil rights leaders, we know that great change is possible.